this video, I'm going to give you an overview of how to use the Canon digital Rebels that we use in our newspaper, yearbook, and broadcast journalism classes at the high school. Whether you're going to go to a game and try to stop the action, or whether you're just going to go into any classroom or auditorium and try to get an average portrait shot, you should be able to get good results when you look at three basic settings that you need to pay attention to on these Rebels. One setting that we're going to look at is the ISO setting. A second that we're going to look at is how aperture applies to the results that you get. And the third is speed priority settings. We're also going to look at a little bit of the other basic quirks that can go wrong sometimes if you don't pay attention to them before you go out. So, let's begin. Okay, so the first thing that I want to address with a Rebel is the ISO setting. All of the settings that I'm going to talk about, the ISO, the aperture, and the speed priority, have inverse relationships of advantages and disadvantages. So there are upsides and downsides to everything that you're going to pick, and that's why we go through them so that you know what circumstance applies to the setting that you're going to pick. The ISO is a good place to start before you pick any settings on the camera. It's found on the camera right here. There's the power button, I have it turned on, and then you push the ISO button and you're going to see a range from 100 all the way up to 6400. I have it set on 100 right now. I'm going to hit set, and you'll see it pop up on this panel right here. So, what is an ISO setting? What it is it's basically a meter that regulates a sensor in the camera that allows how sensitive the camera is going to evaluate the light that's coming in. If you're outside on a sunny day, or in a very well lit inside spot, you usually start with the lowest setting. So when you have high light, you want to keep that sensor as low as you can get. When you're at the lowest setting, which is 100, you get very sharp shots with very little grain. The general rule of thumb for ISO setting, no matter where you are, whether it's light or dark, is to try to keep this ISO number as low as you can get it, because that has the sharpest results with very little grain. So when you're outside shooting that track meet in the middle of the afternoon and you have that on 100, you're going to get very, very crisp results. As the day goes on and those track events go longer into the night, or perhaps maybe you start off on a cloudy day, not quite as much available light, you might try setting it on 400 instead. 400, what it does is the sensor is now increased, and it helps to soak in more light to get your shots to be the right exposure so that you don't have really dark shots when you're shooting with the camera. As I said, there are inverse relationships to this though. When the number goes higher, the shots get progressively grainier, and so the results are not as crisp as what you would have had before. The newer digital cameras, the grain is not nearly as bad as they were back in the days when I was younger and shooting with film. But still, you will see differences between a 100 setting and a 400 setting, and on up higher as you go. Generally, as you move into the building then, you're probably going to get into the 800 or 1600 range to get a good exposure with this camera, because many of the rooms do not have a lot of good lighting. They have fluorescent lighting, and it's not usually put in the best spots. So we usually shoot at about 800 to 1600 when we're inside the building. These shots become progressively grainy, but it's not as bad as what it could be. They're still pretty good. When you're shooting sports, many times you're going to start at 1600, and you might have to go up to 3200, or if you're going to the auditorium, you might even have to go up to 6400. This is where things get pretty grainy, and you can see it right away. But it's much better to have a shot that you can see with the right lighting than it is to shoot something at a lower, crisper setting, but it's way too dark to use. Even with Photoshop, you can't get that image back. So the general rule overall, once again, is to keep that ISO setting as low as you can get it to still get a well-lit exposure with each shot that you're going to take. This is the first step to start on when you're walking out with that camera. Sometimes what you'll do is you'll go out and you'll find that someone has set this on 64 or 32 or 1600,
and you're going out to shoot a track meet. And there's a lot of sun, and that the ISO meter is set to soak in, overcompensate for the lighting. So the results that you're going to get when shooting in bright sunshine with a 1600 setting is going to be way too bright. Everything is going to be fried out as if it's just, you can't hardly see the image. It'll be ghost-like on the image. So it's very important before you go out to make sure that you have your ISO setting set for the right environment that you're going to take your pictures in. So I'm going to show you what happens when you look at the aperture setting on a camera. I took the lens off an old, actually film camera, and you can see the settings for the aperture right up here on this dial, going all the way from a high setting of 22 down to this low setting of 0.14. When I put it all the way down to 0.14, I am opening this up like an owl's eye and letting in almost as much light as is possible through this lens into the camera. You can go into very dark spots and get very good results when that setting is low. When you use this setting, your depth of field, however, is very limited. Usually what you focus on is the only thing in focus, and everything in front or in back of that shot is going to be out of focus. When you want to have everything from the foreground to the background in focus, you make this aperture the highest setting that you can get. The disadvantage of this, as you can see, is that you have also reduced the amount of light that can come into the camera. So if you go into a dark, light restricted area, you are going to find that it's very hard to get a good shot because you'll have to set the camera probably on a tripod to be able to get enough time for that exposure to happen. Of course, if you're outside in a bright spot or in a very well lit room, you can use this low setting and still get those results. But generally speaking, if you get that aperture set at very high amounts, you're not going to be able to have enough light to be able to handhold that camera and still get a steady shot. So there you have it. By adjusting the aperture, you're basically adjusting the width of the hose of light that comes into your camera to get various results. Trade-offs: depth of field decreasing, depth of field increasing. And that's how you get different effects based on what you want. So the aperture setting on the Rebel is the next thing that we want to address, and it is right here on top with this dial. When you turn this dial, you want the AV setting, aperture priority, to be right parallel with this white line. And then there is a little wheel right here that you can spin with your finger that will adjust what you get. So I'm going to turn the camera on, and I'm going to spin that wheel. It was set at the lowest setting, which is that owl eye opening, a very wide open aperture, very small depth of field. If I want everything in the foreground and background, however, to be in focus with a very wide depth of field, I get that number to go as high as it can go, progressively higher, given whatever you need for your effect. Remember though, when you have this number high, a pinhole opening, not much light is coming in, and if you're in a dark environment, you're not going to get a very good shot because you'll have to put it on a tripod to be able to have a steady shot to get the right exposure. You can find yourself somewhere in the middle if need be, but usually we get most of our good results by setting this as low as what we can and going into those darker spots with a shallow depth of field. Honestly, many of the spots that we're shooting have a lot of distracting backgrounds, so it's good to focus just on your subject. Make sure you set your focus right, and the foreground and the background will be out of focus, like posters on a teacher's wall that take away from the emotion of the shot, or somebody's coming down the court and you just want to have the concentration in the eyes of that basketball player as she pushes that ball up the field to the rest of the players. Keep that shot low. You're going to have good lighting because that owl eye is going to be open and all the distracting elements are going to be out. Okay? However, maybe you're going to shoot a marching band shot and you're outside at practice, during fifth period. Keep that number high, and that trumpet player with the sun gleaming right up in the foreground all the way to the symmetrically lined up rest of the members of the formation will be from foreground to background in focus, everyone plainly seen with the high number and small pinhole opening for the light to come in. Okay, so that's a basic overview. So the inverse relations, the higher the number, the more in focus, all of the foreground and background. The lower the number, the less the depth of field. And you have to make sure that your subject's in focus for, to be able to get good results. That's aperture priority. So here are a few examples of putting that aperture setting into practice. One time in the yearbook class, we have an apple tree right outside my window, and we decided to go down and pick some apples off the tree. So I gave a number of students cameras, and we spent the class period picking those apples down. The students have been taught how to use that aperture earlier in the year, and they got lots of different results based on what their vision was from that event. Some of the shots were just medium shots. The aperture was right in the middle. The foreground was mostly in focus, but if you look toward the back, there are some things starting to disappear. Other shots really played with the shallow depth of field. In order to do that, remember, you have to take that number and make it as low as it can go, down to like 2.8 or 1.4, and that allows you to have a very tiny speck be in focus with much of the fore and background aspects of the photo be out of focus, and thereby calling attention to that one thing that you want to have attention called to. So the opposite of this is when we take the aperture and we make it as high a number as what we can get, and that increases the depth of field all the way from the foreground to the background. Sometimes a shot has no distracting background elements and you want to see everything from all those ranges. I went on a backpacking trip in the Rocky Mountains, and I wanted to have that aperture be as high as I could get it so I could see all of that glorious detail. For this next sequence, what I'd like to show you is how speed looks when you are changing the settings on a camera. So what I have here is an old film camera that we used to use back in the days when we shot and developed all the stuff in the darkroom, our Pentax camera here. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you when I set the speed to a slow speed what it looks like inside the camera. So I wind up my film, hypothetically. If you look at that gate right there, watch when I push the shutter release. Okay, so that was open for about a half second. Now, when I change the speed to a quick setting, I have 1/1000th of a second, wind it up again. Now see if you can see that shutter. That was 1/1000th of a second. That gives you an idea how changing the speed setting on your camera also changes the amount of light that can actually strike the sensor in your digital camera. If it's set for a very quick time, you're not going to get much light that's going to come in, and that's why you see the action frozen on the frame. There is no blur because it's only open for a wink of time. If it's open for a long time, then from the time that you push the shutter release, you will see to the end of that gate closing for the exposure to happen. You can see a lot of change happen with where that subject is if he or she is moving. So the next topic I'd like to address is the speed priority setting on the Digital Rebel. You're going to find this setting right next to the aperture priority. For some reason, speed priority is designated with TV. You want that to be on the dial, parallel to that white line, just like you did with the aperture priority. And when you flick that TV right next to the white line, you, just like aperture priority, you can adjust your settings by spinning this little wheel up here. You can go to very slow speeds, up to like when you see 1 with those 2 little hashes like a quote mark, you're at 1 second. And you know, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, you're getting way up there. You need a tripod for this if you're going to get up to that slow. To hand hold a camera, the slowest setting that you really can do if you got your feet propped right and your elbows in and you're holding your breath is 1/60th of a second. If you go any slower than this, you probably have some shake. If you wind up having to do that, maybe sit down and put your hands on, put the camera on your knees or put your shoulder against a wall. Try to brace yourself. 1/60th of a second is about as slow as you can get to get a good steady shot with practice. As you get higher, you are going to stop this action, freezing it in frame you won't see any blur at all. If you're shooting sport shots and you're getting especially up to like 1/1000th of a second, you're going to just really freeze that action. You're going to see that high jumper way up in the air. You get all the way up to 1/4000th of a second when that high jumper hits the pit, the sand pit, for the long jump I should say, and the sand is flying up. You'll get all those grains of sand be frozen right in the middle of the air. Sometimes, most of the time what students do when they're adjusting their speed priorities is that they select this setting when they are shooting sports, especially outside, and they don't have to worry too much about the light. They let the camera take over all those special settings, and they just get it jacked up as high as they can go because they want to stop that shot. However, stopping the action with sports is not always what you want to do. Sometimes you can get the settings to be a little slower and introduce some purposeful blur so that you'll get some of the main parts, like maybe the eyes and head of the subject, be stopped with isolated very clearly, but maybe arms or legs will be blurred or the background will be blurred. You can also use this setting to introduce panning shots. And I'll talk a little bit about panning shots when I show you some examples of what happens. But you have to get that shutter speed to be slower in order to get panning shots to work. Generally speaking, the slower that the lens is, the easier it is to get available light because that shutter is staying open for a longer period of time. However, because it's open for a longer period of time, if your subject is moving, you introduce blur. So that's the inverse relationship with going with a shutter speed priority. The longer it's open, the more blur you may have, but the easier it is to get shots in dark settings because you're introducing more light because that lens is simply open for a longer period of time. That is speed priority in a nutshell. So here are some examples of the results that you can get by adjusting your speed priority settings. The first thing that a lot of students want to do is they want to freeze action cold, absolutely ice cold in sports settings. So you do that by getting your setting up to like 1/1000th of a second or greater. Even in the activity where we were picking apples, we wanted to see if we could freeze one of these apples as a student dropped it down from the tree into my hands. So we jacked that speed priority setting all the way up to like 1/1000th of a second or greater. Another neat advantage that you can have with this is to hold down your shutter release and continue to take shots as it develops. So that way, if there's a split-second moment that you're looking for, you can grab frame by frame, like you can get what's called burst mode. You can get like 3 frames per second. And this was used in a food assembly a number of years ago to get Mrs. Black reacting to the destruction of her pop can tower. These photos went on to win a contest at the state level. Sometimes a little bit of blur actually lends a little bit of motion to the shot, as in this picture which was taken at a food drive event of the superintendent at a track meet. By lowering the setting below 1/1000th of a second, actually down to probably like 1/200th of a second, the blur makes it look like he's really traveling. If he was stopped cold, it would look like he was frozen in space. A little blur can sometimes go a long way. The next thing I'd like to do is kind of give you a potpourri overview of a number of different settings that you need to be paying attention to when using your camera. Some are quite basic, some are a little bit idiosyncratic just with a Rebel, but all of them pretty simple to adjust. One thing that you need to pay attention to is on the lens here, there are 2 little tabs that will help you to adjust your focus. It says AF, MF. Most of the time you're going to want this to be on AF for autofocus. Sometimes you can use this for creative purposes, or especially sometimes when you're shooting video, for manual focus. And then you would simply use your fingers and thumb to adjust the focus wheel right there. The zoom is behind that focus wheel. This is how you get closer and further away. The second tab right here is stabilizer. I would just say keep it on all the time. It does draw a little bit of battery, but what it does is it helps you to get steadier shots because of a little gyroscopy type thing that's in the lens, and that will get you a lot better results overall. Sometimes people, for some reason or other, they'll toggle this off, keep it on. You're going to get better results when you use that little switch. Another thing that you want to pay attention to is that I showed you how to use the aperture priority and the speed priority buttons, but there are other settings on here too. Sometimes people just like to go out and shoot a shot, especially if they're just doing like portraits or something like that. You can use this little green auto setting. It will do everything automatically for you right there. You can put this setting to shoot shots and make sure that your flash doesn't pop up. This lady's head, put it next to that white wheel right there, and what that is a portrait setting. It'll give you a shallow depth of field, but it will keep your subject in focus as long as you get that him or her or whatever the object is focused right to begin with. The next one down is a landscape shot. Looks like mountains with a cloud. What this is it's a very big depth of field. So everything in the foreground to everything in the background, like a mountain landscape, you'd want to see it all. From those goats up on the peak to that beautiful wildflower that's right down by your toes. Okay? That is what you get if you just want to have an automatic setting and not really think about it much. Let the camera do all the thinking for you. This is a next setting. The wildflower is a macro setting. Sometimes when you put the lens of a camera too close to your subject, it has a hard time focusing. But you want to get really close down to some small objects. You'll want to put it on this macro setting, and that will get you some good results. Highly encourage you to try this from time to time. People overlook the beauty of a small, up-close world, and that's where actually a lot of emotion resides, is right there close to the subject. Sports setting looks like a little guy running. This helps you to stop that action automatically, kind of takes over control. And then down to the very bottom is where we do our movies. That's the setting that you have to do your movie shots. And right here is the kind of the shutter release is different than the shutter release for taking still pictures. That's right here. But for movies, you're going to push this little button right here, and it'll start taking your movie. And then when you're done with whatever it is, segment that you're shooting, you'll push it again and it will stop. Okay? If you want to look at your pictures, there is a play button right here, and you can kind of scroll through, and then you can delete the ones that you need to delete. You can also delete all of your pictures by pushing the menu button, and then just scrolling it, menu, and then scrolling it over to erase images, hit play, and then you'll go through the steps and you'll be able to erase all the images that you need to get rid of right there, all at one time. Sometimes if your camera is stopping, especially when you're recording a movie, you need to reformat the disc. And what you do is, once again under menu, scroll it all the way down to using this, scroll it all the way down to the format setting and hit set. And then hit OK, and it's going to say bye-bye to everything on that camera. So if you have anything on there, it's going to be gone. But from that point on, you shouldn't have that trouble with it shutting down in the middle of your shooting. That on-off switch right there, I think that covers it. So those are some basic things that you need to pay attention to that you might be having some trouble with when using a digital Rebel.
So there you have it, some of the most basic settings that you are going to need to be successful getting results in newspaper, broadcast, or yearbook class. Remember, when you're using these settings, feel free to experiment a little bit. Don't use that same setting the whole time for the whole event. Feel free to adjust it a little bit and learn to be creative. Start with these basics, but branch out. And also remember that photography is a process. It's not really an end result that you're always looking for. It's kind of a walkthrough, many steps. Take lots of shots. Many of your shots are going to be unusable. Don't feel bad about getting bad results. Many times if you go out, you're going to have to take shots over and over and over again, and you'll get those good results. The basic thing, remember the process. It's always just kind of having fun with what you're doing, and the more that you do it, the better that you'll get, and the more creative that you'll become. So, good luck.